person, which I think is a very good way of putting it.
Personally in person, and we've got a chance to catch up on a lot. So I thought I'd start off almost completely at random, since I know you've an interest in history and have written about the Victorians. I thought I'd ask you about a slightly more modern period. Are you a fan of FDR's New Deal?
Yes and no. That FDR's New Deal had bits that were tremendously important and bits that have been viewed as symbolically important but didn't actually change the economy. So some of his building programs are unquestionably important and get economic activity going and lead to long-term economic benefits for the US. Some of the things that he does are less successful and quite expensive, and the economy doesn't turn very quickly under FDR. So I think the myth of FDR is a very powerful one. I think the reality was, as with the reality of all political careers, more nuanced.
There's critique on the right. I remember reading it reflected in Paul Johnson's History of the Modern World, where he goes into this in some detail, that actually all that FDR achieved was to keep wages artificially high, thereby keeping unemployment going higher than it otherwise would be. Do you have a view on that?
Actually, I think the real issue is the closure of the banks very early on in his reign, and he gets wrong the credit crisis aspect of it, and that what we should have learned from the 2008 crisis, but we actually got right in the 1930s, was you have to keep your banking system going. When you have a complete crunch in credit, that leads inevitably to unemployment because you ruin people who are perfectly solvent. The depositors lost their money. So people who had money, who were well off, suddenly found they were ruined, and with that you lose employment. So I think the fundamental mistake of FDR is probably monetary rather than fiscal. And actually this ties in, because I'm sure it's what you want to come on to, where we are now. Because if you go back to the 2008 crisis, we needed a very tight fiscal settlement to allow for a very loose monetary settlement. Why did we need that? Well, because the problem was a banking one, and was that most of our banks were basically insolvent, that their capitalisation ratios were much too low. From memory, the Royal Bank of Scotland was 92 times geared. So it had virtually no capital, very small amount of bad loans, made it technically insolvent. And without the government's backing, that would have been ruinous for millions of people across the economy. But to maintain confidence in the system and to get under control the excesses that had taken place in the noughties, a very tight fiscal settlement was needed. And therefore you needed tax rises and you needed spending cuts to try and get the governmental balance sheet back into balance, but also individuals to do the same so they could begin to repay some of their debt. The current situation is completely and utterly different. There is no fundamental credit crisis. Credit is robust. The reforms post 2008 have ensured that we have a solvent banking system. The problem is a sudden and unexpected collapse in demand. And the collapse in demand has come about partly by government decree and partly because of short-term changes in behaviour relating to the coronavirus. And what the object of the government must be and is to ensure that the structure of the economy is maintained for a bridging period. This is your V-shaped recovery, and essentially the government is trying to build the bridge to make sure that a business that was well-founded in March of this year is still functioning when the economy fully reopens. And that is when the government has to step in with a very significant fiscal stimulus to preserve and protect these businesses that without the lockdown, without all that went with that, would actually have always remained good businesses. And if you look at FDR and you look at Neville Chamberlain, in the 1930s, the British government got its economic policy absolutely right, and the UK recovered much faster than the US. But, and there is an important but, the 1930s like 2008, was basically a monetary problem rather than this type of demand destruction problem or demand postponement problem. And so the solution we had then, which worked very well, was cutting government spending, getting the economy back onto a stable credit footing from which recovery came. That was the 2008 situation. It's very hard to think of a previous occasion when demand has collapsed by government fiat in this way. But this is the type of occasion for which Keynesian solutions are tailor-made. Keynes was not an idiot, but his solutions were applied mistakenly in the post-war period every time there was a dip in economic activity, ignoring the supply and demand consequentials. This is about maintaining the level of supply in the economy for when the demand recovers, because the demand was deflated by an extraordinary external event, not fundamentally by an economic event.
There's a marvellous book by a man called Liaquat Ahmed about the four bankers who, as it were, kept much of the world economy going during the 20s and 30s. Schacht was the German who later became Hitler's main economics person. Norman, Benjamin Strong, who died, and a Frenchman called Moreau. And Ahmed thinks Roosevelt's great achievement actually was to save the banks by doing his famous broadcast in which he persuaded the Americans to take money out from under their mattresses and put them back in the banks. Do you agree with that?
Well, I have difficulty agreeing with that because Roosevelt introduces effectively a confiscatory measure, and you have to put your gold with the government. If it's gold that you've got, it's confiscated. And I don't believe in free countries confiscating people's assets. Confiscated by the government at a fixed price. You could not go to your bank and open your bank vault, your deposit box, without a member of the IRS present to see that you weren't taking gold out. So I don't think that type of illiberal, dictatorial behaviour is something I'm in favour of.
Of course, I was asking about FDR at the start, the obvious reason that he's become, as far as I can see, Boris Johnson's and Michael Gove's latest heroes, a sort of role model to look to in these times. So were you entirely comfortable with that if you're not entirely comfortable with Roosevelt?
Oh, yes, of course I am, because we're talking about the myth of Roosevelt rather than the details of every policy precept of Roosevelt.
And you can disassociate myth from what actually happened in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course you can, because what you did in the 1930s and what you can conceivably do now is different. And we're not America. He had the Citizens Corps for young men to go out and hew wood and so on. That's not realistic in the UK in the 2020s. So the Rooseveltian solutions are not likely to be applicable in detail. And I think what the Prime Minister's been getting at is infrastructure. And there is very good evidence that government expenditure on infrastructure is economically very powerful as long as it's the right infrastructure. And then you come not to Roosevelt, but to Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's building of the interstate highways was transformative for the US economy.
Let's move from Roosevelt and Eisenhower to Andrew Lansley, as I'm hearing a lot of dissatisfaction at present in government circles about part of the inheritance of the Lansley reforms. Namely, we created this body, Public Health England, and gave the NHS in England a lot of operational independence. Come a crisis like this, ministers can't actually tell it what to do when they need to in the middle of a public health crisis. Do you have any sympathy with that view?
Was the piece on Conservative Home this morning written by you? Because it had no name attached.
It was.
Are you going to a Times like anonymous leaders?
It almost certainly would have had my name attached to the
I
bottom.
couldn't find it. Anyway, I thought it read like you, but it was, people used to play this game when my father was editor of the Times, and if they liked a leader, they would kindly say it was his, and if they didn't, they'd say something. Anyway, it's easier to talk in the generalities, but I think the generalities are really important. If you look back over the last 30 years, a conclusion was come to that politicians weren't trusted and they weren't liked and they shouldn't be allowed to run things. And this tied in very much with the founding principle of the European Union that populism couldn't be trusted and therefore democracy had to be tempered and you needed experts to run things because the populist politicians might get carried away and do things that they shouldn't. We found our relationship with the EU extremely uncomfortable, partly because of this, and have left it partly because of this, because there was no accountability for decision making. But we had, over the last 30 years, put into our system any number of bodies that aren't accountable in reality to anybody. That the minister is nominally accountable to Parliament, but the minister can't make any decisions. And so you've had the reverse of Baldwin's comment, haven't you, that power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages. Government ministers have found themselves with responsibility without power. And one of the reasons I was very strongly in favour of leaving the European Union was because I wanted to see the reassertion of democratic control and democratic power. And that's exercised through ministers, not through bureaucrats. And look, it's difficult, as you know, for me to go into the details of evolving policy. But I think it's perfectly fair to talk about the general principle. And I think that general thrust was a mistake. And you see it across bodies, quangos that have evolved over the last few decades. And I think you need to get back to a position where the people who are held to account are the ones who make the decisions. We're the ones who have to go to the electorate and say, frightfully sorry, this hasn't worked as we intended. We need then to be able to say, and this is what we're doing to put it right.
And it's just as a matter of record. 'Tis the case, isn't it, that one of the driving principles behind the Lansley changes, all thought up during opposition, was the Secretary of State should become the Secretary of State for Public Health or something like it, but that the NHS itself operationally should work at arm's length from government.
Well, it was Disraeli who said in his Manchester Free Trade Hall speech, Sanitas sanitatum omnia sanitas, for the primary responsibility of any minister is the health of his people. And he was meaning very much public health.
We will make America great again.